One 30-second TV ad. That's all it took for Donald Trump to slam his fist on the table, grab his phone, and declare, all trade negotiations with Canada are hereby terminated. Not because of a new tariff, not because of a secret deal with China, but because a Canadian province dug up a speech from Ronald Reagan, turned it into a weapon, and fired it straight at Trump's ego. Tonight, we're going to break down the story behind the Reagan ad that blew up Trump-Canada talks. Who actually made this ad? Spoiler, not Ottawa. What Reagan said that made Trump so furious, how one commercial triggered higher tariffs, a diplomatic apology, and the worst chill in US-Canada relations in decades. Stay with me. You're watching Huge Press Room, where we dive into the real power games between Trump, Canada, and the people caught in the middle. If you want more deep dives on Trump versus Canada, tariffs, pipelines, secret calls, hit subscribe, drop a like, and let's get into it. Before we talk about the ad, we need to rewind to the trade war itself. In early 2025, Trump kicked off what he called a necessary reset with America's neighbors. In practice, it was a trade war with Canada and Mexico. He signed orders slapping 25% tariffs on almost all goods coming in from Canada and Mexico, with Canadian oil and energy getting a discounted 10% rate. He used emergency powers designed for national security to go around the US-Mexico-Canada agreement. For Canadians, this wasn't an abstract policy. It meant factories wondering if their US orders would collapse farmers, checking if their products would suddenly be too expensive in American supermarkets. Ordinary people starting a boycott of US travel and products, turning Americano coffee into Canadiano out of pure frustration, and hanging over all of it was Trump's constant threat. If Canada didn't play ball, he would go after cars, steel, lumber, whatever hurt the most. Into that pressure cooker walked one man, Doug Ford, Premier of Ontario. Ford's province is welded into the US economy. Auto plants, cross-border trade, factories built on NAFTA, and then USMCA. When Trump's tariffs hit, Ontario was on the front line. Ford decided to fight back in the most 2025 way possible. Not with a diplomatic note, not with a trade mission, with an ad campaign. The idea behind the ad was actually pretty clever on paper. Instead of lecturing Americans about tariffs in a Canadian voice, Ontario would borrow the voice of a man Trump's base supposedly respects, Ronald Reagan. They dug out Reagan's 1987 radio address on free and fair trade. In that speech, Reagan warned that tariffs and trade barriers hurt every American worker, and that trade wars were a bad deal for the United States in the long run. Ontario's ad team cut that speech into a modern-style spot, dramatic music, images of workers, and Reagan's old words playing over graphics that made it very clear who they were talking about. The message between the lines was simple. If you like Ronald Reagan, you should hate Trump's tariffs. This was not some cheap local TV buy. Reports put the campaign budget at around $75 million, with the ad set to run during Major League Baseball's World Series, right in front of millions of American viewers and millions of voters in Trump's base. Doug Ford later bragged it might be the most successful ad in the history of North America because of the sheer number of impressions it got. But while Ford was smiling in Toronto, another institution in the US was very much not amused, the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute. They went public saying the ad misrepresented Reagan's 1987 remarks, that the audio had been edited, and that Ontario never got permission to use Reagan's words this way. Within hours, that statement landed exactly where you'd expect, on Donald Trump's phone. Trump didn't just see this as a policy disagreement, he saw it as personal betrayal and fraud. On his Truth Social account, he blasted out a furious post saying that the Reagan Foundation had confirmed Canada used a fraudulent ad. The commercial was fake and made it seem like Reagan was anti-tariff and that Reagan actually loved tariffs, a claim historians would probably find creative, to say the least. Then he added the line that detonated like a bomb in Ottawa. All trade negotiations with Canada are hereby terminated. With one post, he announced that talks aimed at defusing the tariff war were over. No warning, no phone call, just rage and a social media nuke. But Trump didn't stop there. He threatened to raise tariffs on Canadian goods by more than 10%, on top of the existing 25% in many sectors. Pushed some products up towards a combined hit of around 45%, according to analysts who looked at the numbers, and he hinted that this was just the beginning if Canada didn't respect the United States. Markets took notice. Canadian exporters started calling their banks, asking what another 10% tariff would do to their margins. The Canadian dollar wobbled. Business groups warned that the ad had just taken an already bad situation and poured gasoline on it. Inside Canada, people started asking a very simple question. Who the hell approved this ad? Here's the twist a lot of people outside Canada missed. The federal government in Ottawa did not make this commercial. It wasn't Mark Carney's Liberal government. It wasn't the Federal Trade Department. It was Ontario's progressive Conservative government run by Doug Ford. According to reports, Carney had actually seen an early version of the ad and told Ford he didn't think it should run, warning it could inflame Trump at the worst possible moment. Ford ran it anyway. For Ontario, this was about sending a message. To Trump, "You're hurting workers in my province." To Ontarians, "I'm fighting back harder than Ottawa." And to Canadian domestic politics, Ford is the guy willing to stand up to Trump while the feds tried to play nice. Carney, on the other hand, had a completely different job. He had to keep the entire Canada-US relationship from collapsing. So what do you do as Prime Minister when a province touches the red button? First, Carney publicly kept his distance. He reminded everyone that foreign relations and trade talks are federal responsibilities and made it clear the ad was not federal policy. Then he boarded a plane for Asia, heading to the APEC summit in South Korea, where Trump would also be present. Behind closed doors, something very different happened. According to multiple news outlets, Carney and Trump ended up at the same dinner hosted by South Korea's president. Away from the cameras, Carney used the opportunity to personally apologize for the ad and told Trump he had advised Ontario not to run it. Trump later bragged about the apology, saying Carney had admitted fault. Carney confirmed he had apologized, not for opposing tariffs, but for the way the ad used Reagan's image and for the timing, right in the middle of a constitutional fight in Washington. Because here's another key piece. At the same time all this was happening, the U.S. Supreme Court was hearing a case about Trump's use of emergency powers to impose tariffs on allies. Trump claimed Ontario's Reagan ad was trying to sway the court, weaponizing a dead president's words to influence an active legal battle over his authority. So in Trump's mind, this wasn't just a rude neighbor. It was a foreign government interfering in America's internal legal fight. Carney's apology was an attempt to put a lid back on a pot that had already boiled over. But there was one problem. Even after the apology, Trump said trade talks would stay frozen. The words had been said, the tariffs stayed. And Canada's leverage did not magically increase because Carney said, sorry. Back in Canada, Doug Ford didn't back down. Instead, he called the ad a huge success, boasting about more than 1 billion impressions and insisting that the point was to show ordinary Americans that tariffs hurt them, not just Canadians. He even got into a separate public feud with the U.S. ambassador to Canada, Pete Hoekstra, after a tense exchange over the campaign. Ford demanded an apology from the ambassador while still planning to appear with him at public events. It was diplomacy, Ontario style, loud, messy, and very public. So you ended up with this strange situation. The federal prime minister apologizing to Trump to try to reopen trade talks. The Ontario premier bragging that his ad hurt Trump enough to make headlines worldwide. And Trump himself using the controversy as proof that he was right to be tough on Canada in the first place. Meanwhile, Canadian businesses were the ones actually paying the price. Underneath all the drama, there's a bigger story. This ad and Trump's reaction exposed 3 core tensions in the Trump-Canada relationship right now. First, who really gets to speak for Canada in Washington? By law, it's the federal government. In practice, a province with enough money and enough anger can buy airtime on American TV and talk directly to U.S. voters. Ontario didn't ask permission from Washington. It didn't ask permission from Ottawa either, really. It just acted. Second, what happens when you weaponize American political icons against a sitting U.S. president? Using Reagan was not an accident. Reagan is still a saint for many U.S. conservatives, especially older Republicans. To take his 1987 warning that tariffs cause trade wars and run it while Trump is in office, is like bringing Reagan's ghost into the courtroom to testify against Trump. Trump could not let that stand. If he ignored it, it looked like Reagan himself was calling him a fool. So he attacked the ad as fake, claimed Reagan loved tariffs, and escalated. Third, it shows just how fragile the relationship really is. If one 30-second ad can freeze all trade talks, trigger threats of another 10% in tariffs, force a prime minister to apologize halfway around the world, then the relationship between Trump's Washington and Carney's Ottawa is already hanging by a thread. Because underneath the slogans and the flags, this isn't just about pride, it's about leverage. Trump's tariffs hurt Canada because Canada still depends heavily on US markets. Ontario's ad hurt Trump because it targeted his legitimacy with his own base using their favorite past president. Both sides reached for whatever weapon they had. So was the Reagan ad a genius move or a disaster? On one hand, it did exactly what it set out to do. It got massive attention in the US. It reminded Americans, especially Republicans, that Reagan himself warned against tariffs and trade wars. It put public pressure on Trump by using his own party's myth against him. On the other hand, it gave Trump an excuse to terminate trade talks and play the victim. It triggered threats of even higher tariffs that Canadian exporters could barely afford. It forced Canada's prime minister into a humiliating diplomatic dance, apologizing for an ad his government didn't even make. In other words, it was a political nuke, explosive, attention-grabbing, and almost impossible to control once you push the button. So here's the real question. Did Ontario's Reagan ad actually help Canada in this trade war? Or did it hand Trump the perfect justification to hit Canada even harder while looking tough at home? Is Doug Ford the guy who finally called out Trump using Reagan's own words? Or the guy who poked the bear at the worst possible moment and made life harder for every Canadian exporter? And what about Carney? Is he the responsible adult trying to repair the damage and keep the economy alive? Or just another leader forced to say sorry to Trump to keep the border open? Let me know what you think in the comments. And if you want to see how this Reagan ad story fits into the bigger picture, Carney's pipeline revolt, the plan to double non-US exports, and how Canada is trying to escape Trump's tariff trap, make sure you're subscribed because that video is already up on the channel. Thanks for watching Huge Press Room. I'll see you in the next one.